What did people eat during the Black Plague? The Black Plague, also called the Black Death, was a devastating global epidemic that swept through Europe, Asia, and North Africa between 1347 and 1351, wiping out an estimated 30% to 60% of Europe's population. The plague was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis and spread primarily via fleas on rats. While the primary concern during the plague years was survival in the face of disease, food and diet were still critical factors in people's lives. The foods they ate during this time were influenced by several factors, including the state of the economy, agricultural conditions, social status, religious restrictions, and the geographical location of the individuals. The period during the Black Plague was characterized by extreme hardship, so food access and types of food varied greatly depending on social class, location, and whether a person was living in an urban or rural area. Below is a breakdown of what people ate during the Black Plague era, considering these variables. 1. The diet of the poor. The majority of people during the Black Plague were poor peasants, and their diets were often monotonous, with limited access to a variety of foods. The poor primarily subsisted on basic staples that were affordable and available to them. Staple foods. Bread. Bread was the cornerstone of the poor person's diet, made primarily from barley, rye, or oats. Wheat bread was more expensive and mostly consumed by the wealthy. Bread was often stale or made into pottage, a kind of stew. Pottage, a thick soup or stew made from vegetables like cabbage, onions, carrots, and leeks, sometimes supplemented with grains, beans, or peas. Meat was rare in these dishes for the lower classes, but if they could afford it, they might add small pieces of salted or dried meat. Vegetables, root vegetables such as turnips, parsnips, carrots, onions, and cabbage were common. These were inexpensive and could grow easily in medieval gardens. Dairy products, milk, cheese, and butter were a part of the diet for some of the rural population, although the ability to store milk was limited, and some people, particularly those in towns, had less access to fresh dairy. Legumes, peas, beans, and lentils were another source of protein and calories, commonly incorporated into pottages and soups. Meat, rarely meat was typically reserved for special occasions or for those who could afford it. However, the poor might have occasionally consumed small amounts of chicken, pork, or sheep, which were often boiled or roasted. What affected their diet during the plague? The Black Plague affected the diet of the lower classes in various ways. Labor shortages, with many workers dying from the plague, agricultural output suffered. As a result, food scarcity occurred in some regions. Food prices. The death of a large portion of the population led to economic disruptions, and in some cases, food prices rose sharply. This meant that some poorer people were unable to afford basic staples. Famine. In areas where the plague coincided with poor harvests or localized famines, people had less access to food and nutrition, which further weakened their resistance to disease. 2. The diet of the wealthy. The wealthy, including nobles, merchants, and clergy, had much more access to diverse and higher quality foods. Their diet was far more varied, and they could afford to buy spices, meats, and luxury foods that were not available to the lower classes. Staple foods. Wheat bread. Wealthier individuals would often eat bread made from wheat flour, which was lighter and more refined compared to the barley or rye bread of the poor. This wheat bread was often white, while the bread of the poor was darker and denser. Meat. Wealthy people could afford various meats such as beef, pork, mutton, and venison. They also ate poultry like chicken, geese, and ducks. Meat was usually roasted, boiled, or stewed. Game. Nobility had access to game animals like deer, boar, hare, and wild fowl, which were hunted in forests or raised on estates. Fish. Fish was commonly eaten by the wealthy, and depending on location, people might have consumed freshwater fish like trout or salmon, or salted fish like herring or cod. Salted fish was also common for preservation. Luxury foods and spices. Spices. The wealthy had access to imported spices from the East, including pepper, cinnamon, cloves, ginger, and saffron. These spices were used not only for flavoring food but also for medicinal purposes. Exotic fruits and vegetables. Wealthy families could afford to import fruits like apples, pears, and cherries, as well as exotic vegetables like asparagus and artichokes. They also had access to sugar, which was an expensive commodity at the time. Wine and ale. The nobility drank a variety of alcoholic beverages. Wine was a popular drink in the Mediterranean regions, while ale and mead were consumed in Northern Europe. What affected their diet during the plague? Isolation and fear. While the wealthy had better access to food, they were often more isolated during the plague. Many nobles fled to their country estates to avoid contracting the plague, leading to changes in food availability in urban areas. Rising prices. Like the poor, the rich were affected by inflation and food shortages, though they were still able to afford to stockpile food and other provisions. Food safety. The Black Plague caused people to become more cautious about food, with some avoiding specific foods out of fear they might be contaminated or carry the disease. 3. Religious influence on diet. Religion, particularly Christianity, played a significant role in shaping food consumption during the medieval period, especially in terms of fasting, dietary restrictions, and rituals. Fasting and meat consumption. During times of plague, religious authorities often encouraged fasting or restricted the consumption of meat on certain days. Christians would commonly refrain from eating meat on Fridays, to commemorate Christ's crucifixion, Lent, and other religious holidays. Instead, they would eat fish or vegetables. Fish was commonly consumed by all classes as a substitute for meat, particularly during religious fasts. However, fish, especially salt-cured or dried fish, was often seen as a necessity to maintain a varied diet during fasting periods. Medicinal food practices. People believed that food could help in the prevention and treatment of illness. Herbal remedies, which were believed to have medicinal properties, were often consumed. Common plants like garlic, onions, ginger, and sage were thought to have the ability to ward off the plague or to strengthen the immune system. Wine and herbal concoctions made from plants like wormwood and lavender were also believed to help with illness. 4. Food preservation and storage. During the Black Plague, people didn't have refrigeration, so they relied on methods like salting, drying, pickling, and smoking to preserve food. These methods helped extend the shelf life of meats, fish, fruits, and vegetables, allowing them to survive during the plague's course. Salted and dried meat, meats such as beef, pork, and fish were often salted or dried to preserve them. This was particularly important for the urban poor who couldn't rely on fresh food supplies. Preserved vegetables, especially in rural areas, were often stored in root cellars, and some were pickled or preserved in vinegar. 5. Food shortages and famine. The Black Plague caused significant disruptions to food production and supply chains. In areas most affected by the plague, labor shortages led to the abandonment of farms and fields, resulting in poor harvests and famine. Agricultural decline. With so many peasants dying from the plague, much of the land went uncultivated, and food shortages occurred. The price of grain skyrocketed in some areas, making it difficult for the poor to access basic sustenance. Famine. In regions where the plague coincided with crop failure or poor harvests, famine became a secondary crisis. Malnutrition, combined with the stress of the plague, left many people even more vulnerable to disease. Conclusion. During the Black Plague, food was an essential part of daily life, but it was often in short supply. The diet of the poor was simple, consisting of bread, pottage, root vegetables, and occasional dairy, while the wealthy enjoyed a more varied and luxurious diet, including meats, fish, and imported spices. However, the general disruption caused by the plague, through death, migration, economic collapse, and crop failure, meant that food became increasingly scarce and expensive, especially for the lower classes. The crisis also led to famine in some regions, further deepening the suffering caused by the disease. Despite the severe circumstances, food remained a central part of medieval life, and the way it was prepared, preserved, and consumed was influenced by factors ranging from social class to religious practices to the profound impacts of the plague itself.